have Dr. Ulrike Strasser, who will present reporting of the Marianas and their inhabitants in the early 18th century Germany, the Jesuit New World messenger as a source of knowledge and colonial fantasy. A little bit about our presenter. Ulrike Strasser is a professor of early modern European history at the University of California, San Diego. Her publications include the award-winning monograph, State of Virginity, Gender, Religion, and Politics in an Early Modern Catholic State, and a recent book, Missionary Men in the Early Modern World, German Jesuits and Pacific Journeys. Dr. Strasser's talk comes from a book she is writing with German historian Renate Dürr. Dr. Ulrike?
Thank you so much. I first of all want to say what a pleasure and honor it is to join your conference from California. My gratitude goes to you for making this possible. As you already heard, this talk is based on a book I'm writing with a German colleague. And unfortunately, time and date differences made it impossible for us to present together, but I wanted to let it be known that this is a shared research project from which I'm reporting on my own today. Could I have the next slide, please? So in 1726, a German Jesuit sat down in Graz, Austria, that's near the border of the Ottoman Empire at the time, to launch what would become the most influential Catholic periodical in 18th century Germany. Entitled Der Neue Welt-Bott, or New World Messenger, it appeared in 40 parts, or 5 big bound volumes, amounting to about 4,500 densely printed folio pages, and featuring information from all over the world. Next slide, please. Now, when German readers opened the first issue of this periodical, they were in for a surprise. Not China or Paraguay, the kind of usual geographical suspects, filled the front pages, but instead they saw reports on an area about which they knew little, if anything, the Marianas on the other side of the globe. The Welt-Bott's first issue alone contains 16 reports from the islands, ranging from 1677 to 1720, and a new map dated 1684. And the Welt-Bott's founding editor, Joseph Stoecklein, obviously wanted his readers to learn about the Marianas. Aside from this front page placement, he included an unusually large number of entries in his comprehensive index for volume 1, those first 8 parts. Information about places, people, natural environment, and culture in the Marianas. The Welt-Bott is only one of a number of missionary journals that appeared in early Enlightenment Europe. And Stoecklein, in fact, modeled his after perhaps the most famous example, the French Lettres édifiantes et curieuses that the French Jesuit Charles Le Gobillard had edited. Now, it's typical for these publications to blend religious edification of the faithful with the education and even entertainment of a broader European public. And in the case of the Jesuits, also, they were put together to counter mounting criticism of the order and its mission at the time. Now, given these many rhetorical purposes, we obviously have to treat the ethnographic information contained in these historical sources with a lot of caution. While scholarship long viewed missionary ethnography as either a translucent window onto cultures outside of Europe, or inversely and more recently, as a hopelessly Eurocentric house of mirrors, scholars now are increasingly suggesting that we understand these sources as the product of a complex process or processes of translations. From when these missionary reports were first generated in a mission site, usually in conversation with the indigenous peoples and knowledge brokers, to their final appearance in a print product like this one, after having undergone multiple linguistic and cultural translations by editors like Joseph Stoecklein. So in short, scholarship now tells us we have to unpack these translation processes to understand what these texts can really tell us about cultures outside of Europe. Now, against this backdrop, I would like to present two arguments in the following. First of all, I want to show that Joseph Stoecklein's organizing principle for reporting about the Marianas was to foreground the role of Germans in the mission, and also to tout the Austrian Habsburg, the rulers of the German Empire, as a global player at a time when Germany did not have any colonies yet, but had plenty of colonial envy. So on the pages of the Welt-Bott, we see German Jesuit commemoration or memoria meet a kind of colonial fantasy life for early modern Germans. In the second part of my talk, I want to argue that even though that's true, there's a strong editorial agenda that influences the selection, redaction, and editing of the reports. They nonetheless contain some interesting information that otherwise might have been lost to the historical record altogether. As we will see in a few examples, German Jesuits gathered this information in dialogue with Chamorro Islanders, whose perspective left traces on the Euro and Germanocentric record. So let me turn to the first part. The next slide, please. Oh, okay. And the next slide, please. This is part one. Okay. So we have already heard that Stoecklein took Le Gobien's Lettres Édifiantes as his model for the German New World Messenger. And starting in the second issue, he was actually printing translations from the Lettres Édifiantes. Given that, it is really quite interesting and telling, I think, that he bypassed altogether another work published by Le Gobien, his Histoire des îles Mariannes of 1700, which was arguably Europe's most prominent printed source on the Marianas. In the opening issue of the Welt-Bott, Stoecklein claimed that Gobien had nothing to offer to him. And because of that, he was printing, as you can see in the quote, letters that now see the light of day, that had been lying in the dust for quite a long time, have not been printed in any language. Now, for the first time, by me, they are brought to the light of day. I can further testify that no author has presented until now this information extensively in German. Now, obviously, this is a bit of a sales pitch, but leaving aside that element, we see that it is true when we look at the letters that Stoecklein presented texts and voices that were at best marginal in other European publications like Gobien's. He begins the story of the mission not with the arrival of San Vitores or the Spaniards in the islands. This history is only mentioned in very brief flashbacks. Instead, he starts the story in the 1680s with the supposedly anxiously awaited arrival of German Jesuits and the anti-Spanish rebellion of 1684 that claimed the lives of Augustino Strohbach from Bohemia and Karl Bouranga from Austria. Those two Germans in particular, Stoecklein hailed as martyrs, and he asked his readers to commemorate them at the beginning of this issue and at the very end. Next slide, please. Now, I'm giving you here an overview of the opening section, just to illustrate visually how Stoecklein built the narrative arc of this opening issue around the story of the lives and death of Germans in the Marianas. There's a first letter that talks about the need for new missionaries and how the mission is overshadowed by violence. Then comes a letter by Bouranga about his desire to die and go to the Marianas and his voyage. And in the middle section, kind of the top of the arc, you have three letters by Augustino Strohbach, which familiarize readers with the geography of the islands, the customs of their inhabitants, and the state of the mission. Now, Stoecklein paired these three middle parts with a map that you see on the left. He made this map, and he claims he did it so that he could help avoid confusion about the names namely the confusion between the previous names and now the colonial place names. So with this map, he was trying to enable readers to localize the action and information in the texts. He dated it 1684, the year of the German's death, forging an inextricable link between island geography and the memoria or commemoration of Strohbach and Poranga. So we have ethnographic, geographical material at the center of this section, and it's really there to highlight German contributions to the mission and to draw German readers into the story about Germans in this Pacific archipelago. Now, the remaining text further tighten this connection between Germans and the Marianas. There is a vita of Poranga that Stoecklein himself cobbled together from Spanish and Italian sources. And then at the very end of the section, he does something he rarely does in the entire set of the Welt-Bott. He breaks with chronology. It's usually a rigid principle of his. But here he breaks with chronology and he inserts a 1719 excerpt from a letter by Joseph Bonani, who was a missionary in Rota at the time. And Strohbach clearly already had a stack of letters from Bonani at hand. So he jumps forward 25 years and he tells us about Bonani. We learn from the letter that Bonani is still fairly new to the island. He's a bit forlorn and disoriented. However, what keeps him going is the example of his German predecessor called Poranga. Thinking about his blood witness, the letter reads, is my greatest joy. We learn that Bonani interviewed the inhabitants of Rota about the rebellion of 1684 and the death of the Germans, and then even went searching for Poranga's physical remains. So as part of his process of identification with the new mission site, Bonani seems to have tried to write a kind of genealogy of Germans in the Marianas. Now, after printing this excerpt, at the end of the entire section, Stoecklein sprang big news on his readers. Bonani couldn't find the bones because those bones are already in Vienna. They are already in the political center of the Austrian Habsburg Empire. So they are here, holy bones connecting Rota and Vienna, and thus all Catholic believers in Vienna who venerated the martyrs' relics brought from the Marianas could do so locally. Now, Stoecklein presented a whole host of letters from Bonani. He clearly valued his writings. This little excerpt in the beginning seems to have just been a teaser. He also seems to have converged with Bonani around this idea of writing Germans into the history of the mission, and also making a connection to the Austrian Habsburg in particular. Let's go to the full-length letter of which we have just heard a little bit of an excerpt. The next slide, please. Note how in this letter, Bonani links the Marianas and the Austrian imperial house, past and future. He expresses his hope that this letter finds the imperial house well, and also with a new male heir. He then goes on to note that this behooves him well, because after all, he is in the Marianas, named after Maria Anna. And then he goes through all her titles and lands on the fact that she was the daughter of German Emperor Ferdinand. That's the culmination of her titles. Now, naming and claiming possessions had accompanied European colonial expansion since the days of Columbus. Once faraway lands were associated with a familiar name, usually the name of a secular monarch, they could become transformed into legitimate domains of power in European eyes. Such renaming, however, was a prerogative of real colonial powers, not of the Austrian Habsburg. They had no colonies to boot. So Maria Anna's naming of the Marianas, of course, was due to the fact that she acted as the Spanish regent queen. Still, Bonani claims here a kind of ersatz colonialism by female proxy for the House of Austria. The same queen also had loosened restrictions for German missionaries, when she was overseeing the mission, so that men like Boranga and Strobach in this first generation were able to actually arrive in the missions and die a heroic death there, giving the Catholic dynasty in Vienna its own martyrs. So Stoecklein in Austria and Bonani in Rota seem to have really joined forces in promoting the commemoration of these German heroic figures through their writings, and retrospectively turning this early history of Germans in the Marianas into the beginning of a tradition of German influence under Austrian Habsburg leadership. So they are using the Mariana as the Austrian queen also as a way to lay claim to the missions and insert the story of Germans into that mission. But given that, nonetheless, the meaning of these texts exceed the intention of their creators. I now want to discuss some of Bonani's ethnographic observations so that you can see the complexity of these texts that go far beyond what the authors and editors intended them to say. We will again see personal elements and biases shaping the content, but I think these missionary reports still shed some light on this time in Chamorro history from the perspective of a German observer. So the next slide, please. My first example, or this is the next section. I should let you take this in. And then the next slide, please. My first example comes from the already cited letter of 1719, and it's a lengthy description of building a sackman. As you can see, Bonani details the type of wood used for construction, how the wood behaves in the water. He describes the strength of the planks, how they are held together, the measurements. He comments on the sails and rudders and nets and devices used to keep the boat balanced even in strong winds. And he also lists indigenous terms for various parts of the ship and different navigators. So he obviously observed canoe building, and he spoke to indigenous people to learn the terms. Now, one might think this reporting was the result of dispassionate ethnographic interest. From the surrounding text, however, we learn that Bonani was less curious than afraid. He had just recently completed an at times terrifying transoceanic journey that was also printed in the Welt-Bott. And now he was faced with the prospect of inter-island travel in smaller boats. Right before this description, he expressed worry about, quote, the frangibility of the Chamorro ships, end of quote. Now, the end of the passage suggests that by the end of his research, he had calmed himself. Note the last sentence, where he concludes, the Marianas know how to steer these little ships with such mastery that there's no worry of shipwreck or drowning. We know that Jesuits, of course, wrote ethnographies in response to what European scholars wanted them to report on. They also often wrote, this example illustrates, to get answers to questions that they had asked themselves in facing challenges in their new mission territory. And they turned to the indigenous to provide those answers. Bonani's reporting here reflects the complex web of interdependencies between Europeans like him and the islanders he ostensibly came to lead. He repeatedly bemoaned in his letters that he was alone and quite lonely among the islanders of Rota. He was the sole Jesuit in the island, and he depended on the indigenous for a host of things, including transportation from Rota to Guam, so that he could meet up with other Jesuits. Regardless of Bonani's personal motivation, though, the German Jesuit left a record of sackman engineering in 1719. So half a century after the beginning of Christian evangelization and Spanish conquest, the art of making and navigating the canoes was clearly alive and well among Chamorros. Forced resettlement and population decline impacted but did not destroy the transmission of navigational technology and knowledge. Now let me get to my second example, because Bonani also sheds light on the transmission of pre-contact spiritual practices. This example deals with the veneration of ancestors and ancestral skulls. Again, there is a personal element driving Bonanni's reporting. He observed and interviewed islanders about all kinds of practices and beliefs to also calibrate, or what the Jesuits would call accommodate, his pastoral strategies to the local conditions. 50 years after the mission, he noted there were only 344 souls left of the original 4,000 islanders in Rota. Now, as much as he wanted to narrate a success story of evangelizing these souls, he also at times couldn't help but give away that reality was more complicated. We see this in this quote, where he begins by locating ancestral veneration in a distant past and blaming the devil for misleading the islanders. The Marianas were formerly a wild people. It starts. Now, when you fast forward to the section where he lists the names, though, for the dead ancestral spirits, he's all of a sudden in the present tense. He says, whom they call in the singular, aniti, but in the plural, manganiti. So indicating that he learned the current vocabulary from indigenous informants. And at the end of the entire section, we learn, of course, that more than nomenclature had survived in Rota. After another digression into the past, how the Macanas handled ancestral skulls, Bonanni arrives in the present, full stop, collapsing the difference between the wild islanders of pre-contact days and his current Christian flock. Quote, I recently burned these types of skulls and bones to ashes. So almost in spite of its author's intentions, this report speaks to the longevity of venerating ancestors in Rota. We know that the burning of ancestral remains goes back to the beginning of the mission. And here we have Bonanni writing in 1719, as we just heard. 25 years later, in a letter of 1744, printed in a later installment in the Welt-Bott, he was still complaining about parishioners who kept and venerated ancestral skulls. So this reporting really shows the tenacity of traditions and of the islanders who upheld them. Forbidden practices did not so much disappear in the wake of military conquest and evangelization, but they seem to have formed a hidden component of Chamorro Catholicism, at least until the mid-18th century. Let me give you a last example. Next slide, please. It deals with a stock topic of European ethnographic writing, nakedness. Since the 16th century, European observers reported on nakedness, and they linked it with barbarity, as well as a simple life in a state of nature without government or civilizational order. For the missionaries, nakedness also stood for life before Christian conversion and for sexual temptation. Dressing the indigenous was part of the religious civilizing mission, the European civilizing mission. And in the Marianas, it dates back, of course, again to the beginning of the mission. From Bonanni, we learn that islanders in Rota still went in the nude in 1720. You see here in the first part, the familiar tropes of barbarity, as well as personal fears he apparently had, that he expresses in his desperate sounding wish. May God make it happen that I do not surrender to the many dangers to which I'm exposed under these naked, wild Christians. Now, the next line shows us that his Christian charges subverted his civilizing attempts in clever ways. Although he was trying to clothe them, whenever he was not around, apparently, they would cast off their clothing, in essence, submitting to Christian hierarchy on an as-needed basis. A recent arrival, Father Bonanni was no match for the islanders who had 50 years of experience of dealing with European outsiders and outnumbered him 344 to 1. To conclude then, published reports on the indigenous peoples of the Marianas under Spanish rule are rather few to begin with, and they are deeply shaped by the perspective and rhetorical aims of their non-indigenous authors and publishers. This is also true of the German Welt-Bott. Joseph Stoecklein reported on the Marianas because the mission allowed him to highlight the heroic deeds of German Jesuits and to present the Austrian Habsburg as a global player. This agenda shaped the selection and redaction of texts and also drew him to the like-minded Bonani, who was struggling to find his way and purpose as a German in the Marianas in Stoecklein's day. But leaving aside intentions of editor and authors, Bonani's writings illuminate, at least in part, indigenous history and culture, from the building of Zacman to ancestral veneration and a preference for nudity. David Atienza has developed the concept of adaptive resistance to describe the continual process of the Chamorro, quote, manifesting political, cultural agency under asymmetric neo-colonial conditions, end of quote. These German texts, it seems to me, contain additional evidence, some of it perhaps not preserved elsewhere, of how Chamorro performed adaptive resistance well into the 18th century. One might even argue that adaptive resistance characterizes the ethnographic texts themselves, insofar as they originated in encounters with Chamorros, on whom German Jesuits like Bonani depended, and whose stories the lopsided European record could never fully civilize. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Strasser. I think based on the comments in the chat box, as you can see, people are really fascinated with the information and your work presented this morning. Very new information to many of us here today. A couple of questions here. We can start. Have these German reports been translated into English, or will they be?
In part, in excerpts, they have been translated in the source collection on Micronesia that Levesque edited. But they will also be translated more fully, I think, as my colleague and I are working on this book together. We have also started to locate some of the originals to understand how much was edited by Joseph Stoecklein. For example, we have looked at the Latin report by Augustino Strohbach, the 1682 ethnography, and some of it is quite different from Stoecklein's presentation. Levesque's translation is based on Stoecklein. So it's also really important to look at the originals, and this is part of what we are doing as we are trying to understand what this massive collection of documents in this Welt-Bott was about. And we were kind of blown away that it started in the Marianas. We didn't expect it, but we are of course delighted that we can tell you about it now.
All right. A question from Don Rubenstein. Have you come across any descriptions of carved wooden or bone religious figures in the Mariana Islands, such as are common objects of veneration in many other Pacific Island cultures?
No, we just may not have yet, but at this point, no. The descriptions of objects are usually of objects that the Jesuits took with them. So Bonani, for instance, took a figure, a depiction of the Virgin Mary from actually the small Bavarian town from which I'm from. So I was astounded to learn that he had taken a copy of that image to Rota.
All right. Okay, so we have a question. One of the letters you presented, I think by Bonani, has a line reading the sails of the canoes, quote, but cut light a rabbit ear. Yeah. Please clarify what it means in the context of the letter.
I think it means that the sail is triangular, because he is trying to explain to German readers, especially landlocked Central Europeans who don't see too many boats, right? He's trying to explain what does this look like. So he says the sail is cut like a rabbit ear, so that he's trying to explain the shape of it. And he's also, and I didn't cite that, sometimes he compares the wood to bushes in Austria, so that he explains this is the kind of bush you would see in Austria that they have here to communicate. So this is what I mean by this translation that's going on. And unless we kind of do it in reverse, right, it's very difficult to really see who he spoke to and what this is about.
Wow. Let's see. It says here, people look forward to reading your book, Dr. Strasser. Let's see. What do we have here? We have one from Dominica Tolentino. Are there similar accounts treated the same way for other places the German missionaries were present at in the Pacific?
There are several letters on the Philippines, and there are letters about the Palaos, but the mission fails essentially. But since the German father Pablo Klein or Paul Klein, who was based in Manila, first recorded information about these islanders, or the Carolines, I guess you would say in contemporary terms, there is information about that in the Welt-Bott.
All right. Okay, well, maybe one day, Dr. Strasser, you'll find your way to the Mariana Islands and do more research and put some context to the letters that you're working with.
Oh, I'd be delighted. I certainly plan to visit your amazing islands at some point. I found reading about them fascinating, and the culture is obviously very alive and rich. So thank you.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation this morning. And we're going to move on to the next presenter.